books we never read.
Except for those we have.
This is episode 14, where we are going to cover Salem's Lot. The whole thing. All in one episode.
I'm Jason.
I'm Nicole.
And we are a little out of practice because of the holidays.
Yeah, we definitely missed cutting books into, weekly episodes for sure. So welcome back if you've been with us, and welcome if this is your first time.
Yeah. So for those of you who chose to do Salem's Lot with us over the course of November or whatever, all in one go, thank you for doing this. We will never do it again. So.
Yeah, I didn't get as much out of it, I think, not having forced myself to stop and process as we read. I mean, it's still a great book, but I just definitely didn't go as deep into it because I was just powering through.
Well, and we're just behind on a lot of things, so tune in for the next episode that's also going to be posted today with our next book.
The syllabus.
Syllabus for the next book, because we're going to keep on going, and I think we're going to have a special Christmas episode where we will do the first chapter of that book for anybody who wants to tag along. So we're excited about that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, what are any other housekeeping issues?
Make sure, as always, if you're watching this video, that this is the video you actually want to watch, because we do spoil things. We talk about the books like you have also already read up to where we've read. So in this case, that is all of Salem's Lot. Please take a look at any of our other books that we've gone through. They're playlisted in the playlist tabs. And also share this with your friends. And please, most importantly, comment. We want to hear what you thought about what you read. There's just no way we can talk about it all. And so we love so much when you guys include your commentary, and we get so much more out of the book from hearing from you.
Yeah, definitely. I've only ever read one Stephen King book before this one. I've watched a lot of Stephen King, right? Whether you have or not.
Oh, yeah.
You've watched Stephen King.
Something.
Hey, we should watch the movie for this tonight, while we're uploading. Do you want to do that?
Oh, yeah!
We'll see if we can find it. Cool. Don't mind us.
That's going to be awesome. We can talk about that in another episode.
Yeah.
A little sidebar.
So, the only Stephen King novel I've ever read was The Long Walk. And I read that in high school, and I don't know why. And it's very dark. It's much darker, I think, in like a human way than this book was. And I read a lot, and I don't know why I've never read Stephen King, but I think there was like a stigma in my mind because like he's so prolific and everybody knows him. It's just sort of like pulp, right? Like there's just stuff coming out, and there's like he's just making stuff, so it can't all be good, right? Like it's just one of those things where I won't name any series in case you guys like them, but like, oh, that person's writing again.
Almost
right?
to the point where you think it's like a ghostwriter situation, yeah?
Well,
like
I don't think that, but there are several other series that came out.
Yeah.
And I guess I lump them into like these authors where I'm just like, it's just
one more.
It's one of these things. But this was really good.
Yeah, well, I had never read Stephen King before because, one, I thought it would be too scary. Because when you're reading, that stuff happens in your head, man. And then number two, I also thought it might be too prolific for me. So Stephen King is used a lot as examples, like when you're teaching about literature and how to write. We use lots of excerpts from Stephen King because he is a craft, he's just a master at the craft. Like he is so good at little pieces. And anytime I read those pieces, I was like, well, that's amazing. I can't read a whole book of this. It'd be wasted on me, But I really loved Salem's Lot, and I really enjoyed all those little passages where I was like, oh, if I was still a teacher, I would totally pull this passage and have my kids model writing like this.
Yeah.
I want to go visit this town, vampires aside. It sounds lovely. Yeah. The people don't, but the place...
Well, and you and I have talked about this several times. Like, I'm a sucker for beautiful prose, and I was pleasantly surprised to find, like, not only that it was like a well-written story, and that's like what has attracted people, but that he is a good author, right? Like there are like sentences in there where I was like, oh, like I'll keep that one, right? Like I like to collect little things like that. So
my whole book was full of highlights of sentences where it was like one sentence that completely created the change of the season or the change of how it felt in the town or brought the town to life in a new way. I've never read a book, and this did not feel like a long book. It felt reasonably appropriate. You know,
Yeah.
I've never read a book that seemed this size that got me so in tune with so many different characters and the town itself and the setting as a character. There were tons of characters in this book.
Yeah, there were a lot.
And I know so much about all of them. Even things I don't want to know about them. And so it made it very personal, and by the time the vampires got everyone, you were either very happy or very sad that they were dead.
Yeah. Well, I'm over here like peeping on your first note, which is like kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But, you know, my favorite chapters were absolutely the chapters from the town's perspective. Like it's a very cool concept, and there are other authors who have done things like that, right? Like, you know, you find out like this is from the perspective of the house the characters lived in or whatever, and so. But having the town like know everyone's secrets, and it tells you like, oh, but this is like the time that there's a bit in there about like some random guy who killed his wife and threw her down a well, and like nobody knows it. Do you remember that? Like it was one of the town's chapters.
I mean, it was just like a quick.
And it was just like everybody thinks she left him, but he killed her, and she's back there. And if anybody would go bother to look,
I don't remember that part.
and no one knows, but the town knows, right? And I really enjoyed that perspective and how much exposition was there.
My favorite town piece was about the telephone pole that was buzzing with the gossip,
Yes. That was very cool.
running on those party lines. I also really loved the detail of, you know, this is from the 70s and there were still party lines and stuff.
But,
so if you're young and you don't know what that is, weren't there party lines in this book? Was that mentioned? Okay, yeah.
But you don't have to be young. One of my best friends right now, his parents' house has a party line.
Well, but most people live in, I guess, city. Well,
right. And they have cell phones, but like they also have a party line.
Yeah. So back when there were landlines, before everyone had an individual number, you know, kind of a whole chunk of area would have the same number, and you had to share this one line. But you could just very quietly pick up the phone and listen to whatever Barbara was talking about to Jimbo and hear everyone's business.
I was at a training for work recently where they were talking about like the differences between generations, and they put a picture of a typewriter up, and they were like, I bet some of y'all don't know what this is. I'm like, of course everybody knows what a typewriter is. But I thought about that whenever I read that party line thing, because like he doesn't explain it, right? He's just like, here's the party line.
Yeah.
And there are so many other things in this book that just because of like when it is set, those technologies have come and gone. And this is a book that while it could be enjoyed for many years to come, will like on some level need a bit of a refresh. And aren't they filming a new version?
They are filming a new version, so it'll be and it's so much easier to do movie.
Yeah, sure.
Renewed.
Yeah.
You know the
well,
book.
It's gonna need it partially because there's so many like weird references either to like publications that no longer exist or technologies that no longer exist, and also because I'm like, let's be honest, there's some language in this book that doesn't like we've moved on, right?
But it really does show that this is a hick small town with the words like the language they use for people.
Yeah, and like I suppose I hear people say things like that in you know my own hick small town, but but still like it was weird and it just. I don't know. It could use some updating, right? And like, if people are going to be biased, they're not biased against those people anymore. And so, like, we're just like, oh, weird.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I did kind of wonder, you know, I'm pretty careful about what I would say needs to be updated in terms of editing. You know, there's novels like To Kill a Mockingbird that has language in it that language is arguably important to the story because that was the language that was used at the time, and it meant something specific in terms of how citizenship was viewed. You know,
there was one thing that was so off the wall, and I don't even necessarily want to repeat it, but like it took me a second to like, what is happening here? And I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah,
it was just like it was just very strange, like, and it wasn't coming out of a character's mouth. I think that's what hit me so strange.
It was in the narration.
Yeah, and I was just like, that's just for me, that's not necessary, right?
And I thought about that too, and was realizing that when it switched, it was always third person, but it was third person limited. So anyone that you were with, that narration was in the style of their own thinking. Right,
and I get that. Yeah, but like it was just still strange.
Yeah. So. Yeah, but also, it really made you understand a lot about the character.
Yeah.
You know, like
Sure.
the way I appear to you and the things I think in my brain are totally different things. And,
Oh, yeah.
and you would think very differently of me if you knew what I was thinking.
Oh, yeah.
And in this book, we really got to see what people were thinking.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. But that also wasn't like the point of the book. You know, like if it was if this was really an exploration of small town people, and like it wasn't, right? It's like a horror story, you know, and like. But
I have an argument
okay.
that it is actually
okay
about small towns.
But anyway, but if it was more like on the nose, like this is what it's about, I think I'd be more accepting to that. But like it was just kind of like, yeah, sure, like that's reasonable, but.
Well, I think he cared about making an immersive experience.
Well, and that it was, so that's fair.
And I don't know. It pulled me out of the book while I was reading it because it was so sometimes disturbing.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear those things.
Yeah. Well,
people think.
I'm not soft, and I hear people say all kinds of crazy stuff all the time.
Like Doug Rogers, to me, was the scariest person in the book.
Which one's he?
The
trash man?
The
dumpster guy?
Yeah.
That was...
He was the scariest person to me.
Yeah, like over here popping rats and stuff. Yeah,
and
that was weird.
Really horrible things about women because they don't like him.
Yeah.
And I've got some commentary on that.
Okay.
Whenever we get to it. Let's see. Another thing that Stephen King is just amazing at, slowing down and speeding up time.
Mm-hmm.
The scene with Mike Ryerson in the graveyard burying the little boy. Mm-hmm. You know, he was waiting on his friend to come back and help him, and his friend wasn't coming back, and then...
And that's when he started, like, staring at the casket and, like, thinking, like, I should pull him out of there.
And his eyes are going to be open.
Yeah.
And, like, there were.
Yeah.
But
and he's there for hours.
And you feel like it.
Yeah.
You were reading it for hours, even though you're not. But it just... King is really, really skilled at drawing out and shrinking up the language in a way that makes you slow down and speed up.
Mm-hmm.
It was so good. So good. Some symbolism that kept popping up in the book. You know, cleansing by fire and confession and baptism and stuff like that. Were you surprised the way that religion was used? You know, against the vampire, you know, like...
I mean, like, that's kind of like...
The holy water and the crosses.
Yeah, it's kind of like how it goes, right? I mean, like, I've read other vampire things and watched other vampire things, and it's always religion that goes after it, right? I thought a lot while reading this about... I think we talked about it in our syllabus episode, but the Netflix show Midnight Mass. Fantastic series.
I did think of it at one time.
If you've never watched it before, but it's about vampires and it has a lot of like religious overtones, and they're set in like similar parts of the country, and in small towns, right? Like there's so much similarity.
It really, it did make me wonder for a minute if Midnight Mass was a Stephen King story.
It is not.
Okay.
It's written by the same guy that did like the house on Haunted Hill or whatever. Yeah. But like all that stuff is to be expected. Right now, I'm a sucker for like religious stuff like that. Like I think it's a lot of fun, and I like seeing it. And one thing that's interesting to me is that there was like no attempt whatsoever to explain why these things work, right?
Except it had to be your belief in it. Is that why Father Cunningham's didn't work? Callahan's. Sorry.
Maybe. I mean, like, I suppose so, right? But like, still, like, what's the mechanics behind that? You know, in Midnight Mass, for example, it's not necessarily like religious symbols that are powerful, but like sunlight and things like, and you can explain like a biological way. Yeah. And there is some talk in this book about like the biology of how could this work, especially with Dr. Cody. But like, why does the cross like light up and do all these other things, right?
Like, why were they glowing?
Who cares? It works, right? And so, and there was no attempt to explain that, and I thought that was kind of interesting, and it didn't really matter why.
What I think is cool, so, you know, going into Salem's Lot, I had no idea what it was going to be about. I didn't know it was going to be about vampires or anything. Mm-hmm. So once I realized it was going to be about vampires, I was like, well, okay, so Stephen King, this is going to be some new vampire stuff, right? Like new rules to vampires. And it wasn't. It just rehashed all the old rules that already existed from vampire stories and literature and Bram Stoker and all that stuff. And for a minute, I was disappointed. Because I was like, well, why do another story?
Mm-hmm.
But then by the end of it, I was just super impressed that he was able to do another story with the exact same vampire mechanics, the rules that already exist, and it was still a super engaging story.
Yeah.
Even though by the time you realized all the rules are the same, you know that it has to end. There's only one way to end it.
Yeah.
You know, and so I thought that was really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And then he did such a great job with it. I think it's funny that Parkins, the sheriff, you know, okay, so when he got scared, I got scared. That one chapter where he was just staring off into the distance and Nolly was like, "You okay?" And he's like, "Nope.
Yep.
I'm scared." I was like, okay, I'm scared too now. But then, so like he put on his little cross and he put on his little saint thing and he put on his little peace sign.
Yeah.
Layer it up, because I think that's the key, right? Like if you believe that it holds the power of good,
right,
then it's going to overpower the vamps.
Right.
Can we call them vamps?
You can say that.
Is that I was going to say, is that like some street slang? That's something I shouldn't be saying?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah. I thought that was all really cool, you know, and I have, and, you know, talking about like the different symbols and all that, I'm interested in like why certain bad guys are popular. Like that's something I think about a lot. And so, for example, there was like a very long period of time where, you know, so number one, like it has become unkosher to have. You can't just always have the Russians as your enemies anymore, right? Like, and they're, and like you can, and nobody's gonna mind you having a movie where you're fighting Russians, like whatever. But you can't. There are real world consequences to constantly pushing this group of people as the other and as the enemy, and I buy into that. Like I think that's true. And so we need to be very careful about constantly having the Chinese or the Russians or whatever being the enemy, you know. And there was being a 9/11 kid, you know, there was a period of time where like you could buy video games where you're like running around and you were shooting at, you know, Arab folks or Muslim people or like whatever country the game was set in, you know. And that's not good, you know. And so we need to have, while there's no problem with having literature where the enemy is, you know, a human being, that's fine. We really have gotten away from genres where the enemy is another human being, right? Like we really don't have the whole like Soviet Union spy warfare thing anymore. That's like gone.
007.
Yeah, it just doesn't really exist. And we have replaced it with these fantastical enemies. And and the real enemy, the human enemies that we had, clearly spoke to a real fear that we had, right? A fear of Russians, a fear of the Chinese, a fear of terrorism, whatever it was. But I think these fictional enemies speak to a real fear that we have as well. And there was a period of time where like aliens were the big thing. And it was because we were starting to become, you know, a spacefaring race, and then we cut it out, you know, for a little while. And now we're picking it back up. But we started really thinking about these things, and we're able to send out signals to people. So then you start having those signals answered in fiction. And whereas science sometimes just does things without thinking about the consequences of them.
Like Jurassic Park.
Yeah, well, the authors took the time to think about what the consequences were. Somebody was at least doing that. And I think that, especially with like zombies and vampires, those are two really common things now. And I think zombie speaks to a fear of disease and a fear of like that could actually happen, and there's something to it. And a fear of like being a drone. And there's something about like consumerism there or something. But with vampires, I think it's about a fear of the elite and what they are doing. Like you know, there's something like there's some Pizzagate aspect to this, right? Like there's like what are they doing? And they're taking things from us and they're sucking our blood, right? Like the elite are using our labor. They're using us to become better or like to improve themselves. And there's something about vampires in a small town that I think speaks to that fear, right? Here comes this person, right? Maybe it's not a vampire, maybe it's a developer, right? And this town becomes something that it wasn't before because this bigwig person, this elite, right? This person with the money comes in and sucks the life out of the town for their own betterment and leaves something different. And I think that's really what the modern vampire genre speaks to. And vampire's really popular. People may forget this, but vampire literature was really popular right around the time that Occupy Wall Street started. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
Yeah.
So, that was a long story. I'm sorry. Thank you.
No, I mean, no, I think that was great. And I mean, I take it one further in that vampire can represent. I really loved that you pointed that out, that it can be, you know, the elite sucking the energies and work off of the people below. But replace that with anything that's like sucking the life out of something else. And so at one point, and this all kind of happened around chapter 13 and 14 for me, where I started thinking like, this is just about the destruction of small town, right? Of good old little town USA. And that's, you know, when the Walmart finally comes into a small town and it shuts down the entire downtown, all the hardware stores, the small grocers, you know, the 5 and dime, which it's just, you know, the 10 and 20. But like, I saw that, you know, happening.
Or like, I think about where we live, how many towns dried up because the interstates were built directly past it, right? Like if you're where we're at, if you're not on an interstate, you ain't nothing.
Yeah.
You know?
And there were so many references to that in the book of, you know, to the people that were just on the freeway, just zooming right past, because this was kind of a closet community. You had to want to go to Salem's Lot to get to Salem's Lot. Yeah. And people would just drive past and be like, well, that's weird, everyone's lights are on, you know, and just tootle on down the road. The other thing that I noticed in this book was kind of like, again, like how well the book encapsulates small town America, right? This town, Salem's Lot, was the good old days, right? Before the vampires took over everything. But what you really see is, like, at best, the good old days was like stifled progress. And at worst was like hicktown ignorance, you know? And I thought it was interesting that it really affected the women of the town so much. Women were sluts if they didn't like you. They were forced, you know, expected to become mothers even if they were not well suited to be mothers. And
man, that was one of the hardest parts for me, that part of the book.
We have Susan, who wanted to get out. She was very independent. She was kind of progressive, reading these novels that had, you know, risky topics in them that a lot of people didn't approve of. Well, what room was there for her in this town? None. She died. Right. Because there was no room for her there. And so that just really, I got really interested in that as I went. And I was kind of halfway between, like, am I just, like, digging too deep? Like, am I seeing stuff that's not really there? But it was just
definitely the treatment of women in the book was incredibly interesting to me, because that was one of the more like realistic parts of the book, where I think that like so much of that stuff happens and either it's not important to the story, so an author will ignore it, or, you know, like that's a hard topic to talk about, so it will be ignored. And it was not an important aspect of this story, but it was not ignored.
I think it was an important aspect. I don't think it would have included all of these Reggie. Yeah. And like how it ended after he scared the boy off. Yeah. I mean, he raped his wife every night. Like, these details aren't included, like you said, unless the author wants us to really have that intimate view of these people in this town.
And I think he does want it to. It doesn't like progress the story in terms of like, you need to know this because that makes this next thing happen. Like that doesn't necessarily happen. But like if he's painting a picture of a small town, like, hey,
that's part of the picture.
They may not lock the doors, but if you opened it.
Right, yeah, there's terror going on inside of those doors. That's a really good point. Yeah, Reggie.
Yeah.
And I
that might have been one of the scariest part for me.
Like Dud and Reggie, like those are the poisons in system. Those are the real vampires. Those are the real people that we have to be afraid of in real life.
Well, but even then, like if you want to, like, those are the kinds of people that, you know, need to get picked up and put somewhere for everybody's safety or whatever. But like, if you want to talk about the people who are the poisons, there's more mundane poison. There's there's poison that more regularly kills life, and that's Susan's mom, right? Ooh, and like people like that, right? Yeah. Like who just they're constantly bringing people down, like putting in these little jabs, death by 1,000 cuts, you know. So.
Good observation. Susan was, I mean, not Susan, Susan's mom was something else.
Her dad was great.
Yeah, he was like,
Really?
let's barbecue.
Yeah, everybody likes a good barbecue.
Yeah, he was great. Some of the, back to the language that we talked about. There's some things that we're just not going to repeat on the show, but I will say too that I might incorporate into my day to day. Number 1, sex prevert.
Is that new for you? Prevert? I say that all the time.
And jahoobies.
Oh yeah. I don't know if that's bad or not, but yeah, jahoobies.
Jahoobies. I mean, it's just another word.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
So if your kids are listening, just tell them it's a type of.
Well, you know what, and that's funny. It's like everybody has their own words, right? My
Jahoobie.
brother and I specifically have words that we say that like don't exist, and I'm sure everybody has those. And so, slipping those in. Don't give everybody our secret word. Slipping all those in. I thought this was very intimate.
Prevert, and multiple people used prevert.
Yeah. When you're not that familiar with it, it's funny.
Let's see. Chapter 14, part 16. It was a lot chapter. Describing how the lot shuts down for the night, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you were seeing through the window of people's homes as they were eating dinner, and some old grumpy guy was like, "Eat your Brussels sprouts," even though he didn't like them either, and it was the normal routine, everything shutting down, but with that like line of poison running through the city. You know, I mean, it gave me chills just thinking about it. Like he just really just took us along that journey of everything falling apart.
There's a really famous author that I read when I was a kid. His name's Frank Peretti. He does like Christian fiction, and he is like he's the answer to Stephen King, but for like that particular genre, right? So like Christian fiction is like such a bizarre concept, like looking back on it now as a well-read person, but he was incredibly popular because people wanted to read stuff, but they wanted it to have that element. And he has this book, I think it's called The Oath, and there are elements like that where like basically, sorry if you're gonna bother to go read this book, it's ancient, but there's like a dragon in town, but the dragon is the people's sin. And there's this like, and that part kind of like those little chapters like that where you see underneath the hood and you're like, what is, like, this is not perfect. And there's this thing, you know, and you know, it's the fact that people don't necessarily care about each other, and that there is this unneighborliness, and that they know that like sometimes you hear loud bangs from the neighbor's house because they're beating each other, and like you shouldn't go bother, and that's why nobody goes to check on them, and that's why the vampires are able to proliferate, right? It's because nobody's like actually caring about each other and being like, hey, like where's everybody today? You know? And I just kind of like think back to that book from my childhood about that sort of thing. We can read it if you want to. It's not good.
Nah, I'm good. Poor Mark, right? Like the kid.
Yeah.
I mean, what a great kid. You know, even as his first appearance in the book was outsmarting the bully and knowing what a thin line he was walking with that outsmarting, and you know, super great kid. But gosh, the things that he's seeing.
Well, Mark's an interesting character because the first time we actually see him is in the book is in Mexico.
Yeah,
and we don't know that
we don't know it's him.
But I mean, and at that point he's actually considering joining the church, right? Like
he like does his full confession.
And then you see him confront the bully, and then he drops off for like half the book, and then comes back, right? So he was a very like sporadic character for me, but the fact that all the adults like really relied on him for nerve, right? And they were like, you can't give up now because like you're keeping me. It was just so much pressure to like realistically put on a child, but there was something about like his understanding of it was just simple.
Well, and I think also just because he's a child, he is that symbol of innocence. And when you're an adult and you have faced with your girlfriend has been vampired, your father, your priest has been vampired, all your buddies, it's all over. At some point, you're just like, I mean, maybe I just call it quits, right? But no, there's a kid here, right? And so, if for nothing else, you put all of your like savior energy into this child because that's the one innocent thing left.
Yeah. Well, and he was involved in every like abortive attempt to get rid of these vampires because because of that simplicity. He was like poking around in the woods and saw Susan going up there and was like, "Oh, well, she's boned. I should go go help out with that." And then that doesn't work. And then he goes up there with like the father, and that doesn't work. And he goes up there with Dr. Cody or whatever, and that doesn't work.
That
And
was
he was there for.
death.
They never got the whole gang together.
Yeah.
But Mark was there for every one of those. So.
Well, and you know, when we watched it and we understood it from the perspective of this is really a story about kind of the trauma of growing up, of leaving childhood behind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I wonder what element of that is kind of in this as well.
Yeah. I thought about that too. And I'm not, like, I felt like that might have been, like, forcing a little too much. I'm much more interested in this elite idea of, you know, abusing a small town kind of thing. But there's definitely something to that. And there were several things that I thought were just kind of almost the author looking at the camera and saying, like, hey, but there's a kid here, and like, this is kind of crazy, and this is, but like, sometimes kids have to grow up and do tough things.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. You know, but Mark is a good example of just, you know, resiliency and just clever, precocious kid. You know, I don't know. It was fun, and it didn't feel weird. I don't know. I did like the little parts about, you know, these guys going through all this really bonded them together. They were not all great friends. They were becoming friends. You know, but they really, like, loved each other through this. They were holding hands, and, I mean, Ben, you know, even told Mark that he loved him, and, I mean, it was giving him something to live for, you know?
One of my favorite chapters, what is the name of the guy who ends up in the hospital? That's Matt.
Yes, that's the teacher.
That's the teacher. Okay. So when I was a kid, I very clearly remember doing the dishes, and we had like a window at the sink, and I was like, what if a face popped out? And then immediately a face popped out, and it was my dad, and he just happened to do it right at the time I was thinking. And now every time I do dishes in front of like a window, I'm like, what is out there, right? Like, I just think about that kind of thing. And I think some of the best horror is some of that jump out horror, right? Like you or at home alone, it's bright daylight, you open your clothes washer to put some clothes in, and like a zombie lady just crawls out. Like, stuff like that, I think is like, that hits so hard because now it's going to live in your head rent free, and you're stuck with it, right? But one of my favorite scenes is Susan going over to Matt's house. Matt is like, all right, so here's what's going on, right? And then he says, wait, my boards don't creak like that. And she's like, okay. And then this whole thing with Mike Ryerson up there again, and all that. And I love that scene because I know how my boards creak.
Yeah.
And everybody does. And so that little sort of like interaction, and then somebody else saying, well, like, are you sure? Are you sure? But like, yes, I know. And there's nothing you could ever prove. And she never saw Mike, I don't think, in that scene.
No, but she did find his ring.
She did find his ring. But like, and so, you know, could he be up there making voices or whatever? And I really tried to think about, what if somebody came to me and told me this, you know? If you told me there was like zombies, I'd be, all right, let's go. Let's get ready. But like most other people, I'd be like, are you high? Right? Like, what is happening?
Yeah, it would be too hard to believe. Speaking of Matt, when he asked for Dr. Callahan to come and see him, or Father Callahan to come and see him, and Father Callahan was kind of anticipating what this conversation was going to be. When you've had a heart attack, you're just like, how could my body betray me like this? You know, that, again, not relevant to the story, but it was just narrative that I loved.
Yeah. Yeah. So what happens with Father Callahan? Is he bit? He gets on the bus. What is he?
The vampire tells him to come drink his blood.
Yeah. And so, and a lot of times in like these vampire kind of shows, you have like two kinds of vampires. You have like the creator kind, and then you have like the drone kind. And it seems like Father Callahan was invited to become like one of these master types. But he gets on a bus and like leaves, right?
Yeah.
Do we ever see him again?
No, he asked for beer, when they stop somewhere.
So he's like out there.
And he's supposed to be going to New York. So yeah, there's still, dun dun dun, part 2.
Yeah, okay.
New York slot. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the way the book wrapped up.
Burn it to the ground.
Where they come back from Mexico, basically,
yeah.
right? And they're like, all right, time to light on fire. Because that's one of those things, it's, they refer to it as Chekhov's gun, right? Very early in this book, we were introduced to this idea that there was this fire in the 50s.
The Great Fire of 57 or whatever.
And it came back over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I was like, who cares? Like, why is this important? And I kept thinking maybe we'd find out something. Like, honestly, what I kept thinking was we were going to find out that Ben had lit the fire.
Oh.
Like, as a child. And that's why I thought it was important. And maybe that was, like, some part of this guilt and trauma that he was, like, trying to, like, sort through or whatever. And it turns out Ben lit the fire, just the next one. And all of that made sense to me, how they ended up tying that in. And legend says this is where the fire started because somebody flicked their cigarette or whatever the deal was. And I enjoyed that tie-in.
Yeah.
And fire is one of those cleansing things, right?
Right.
And so there's a poetic element to it, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, the boy gave his confession. They got their holy water.
Well, and beyond that, like, fire creates light, and these are creatures of the darkness, and so there's nowhere to hide.
Yeah. Another symbol that I thought was interesting was the paperweight that Ben had taken from the house as a child.
Mm-hmm. Snow globe.
Yeah, and he, kept it throughout his life as kind of like what we talked about in the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. That was his symbol that, like, reminded him of something that was important to him. And eventually that was going to be him teaching himself that nightmare, that thing that he saw as a child wasn't real. But that didn't work out. Like, sometimes the nightmare is worse in reality,
Who was it that said that they gave us a little talk about the creature that lived in their closet?
That was Callahan.
That was Father Callahan?
Yeah.
So that conversation...
I had forgotten about that.
That was such an interesting thing because, it's this terror, and that's the part I was thinking of that really was about growing up.
Yeah.
Right? Because these things are real, and then you banish these things and you no longer believe in them. And there's no reason to think that his monster was real. But he saw his monster in...
the vampire.
In the vampire. And he calls the vampire by that name.
Yeah,
at one
Mr.
point.
Fluffy or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
That was a very fun part for me as well, right?
Yeah.
And it makes you think about, like, all these things, all the possibility and all the wonder that you have as a child that, like, people just beat out of you. And then what happens when that wonder is just there? It's hiding. And then it comes back and, like, oh, Fluffy. Here we go.
Yeah. Well, and for them, they at least got a chance to have a childhood and banish those demons and then live a life of their choice, knowing that demon wasn't real. But for Mark, he never had demons and then learned that all these demons are real.
Yeah.
And so what kind of life does he get to have ahead of him?
Yeah. Well, but doesn't that happen to all of us? Right.
But I like that, at the end of it, he shattered the paperweight and didn't stick around to see what came out of it.
Yeah.
Just shattered it. There was just a lot of tying things up in a nice little bow at the end.
Yeah.
I thought that was cool. That is all my notes. That's everything I got.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I really... This was... If we had taken more time, I think I would have more, like, analysis. And that's one of my favorite things about this show, is analyzing these things. And I don't know if anybody will ever care about my theory about vampires and elites or whatever. And that's not, like, something original to myself, right? But that was something that I really would have liked to slow down and explore more. And thinking about, like, the childhood elements and all that. And if we watch that movie tonight, we can... we could talk about it some more.
Yeah, we can do like a episode 14.5.
Yeah. It's just 2.1 in case we need to make 4 more.
For every version of Salem's Lot that ever comes out.
Yeah. but I definitely enjoyed it, and I think I am open to doing more Stephen King in the future. You know, or more horror, right? Of
for
some
sure.
kind. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it only gave me nightmares one night. I don't remember what I read, but I read it right before bed, and I fell asleep, and then I woke up, and I was like wigging out. But
one of our members of the book club that kind of hangs out and watches and reads along and stuff said that she had read this when she was a lot younger, and she was terrified to let anyone into her house for the longest time. She said it really got to her, and yeah, and the images of the little vampire minions, you know, clinging to the windows.
All right,
and
Danny Glick. I can't remember the name of the movie, but it's not a vampire, but there's like this demon possessed baby, and it's under a car at some point, and like skitters around and crawls, and that is not for me.
Why can't you just be normal?
It might be that movie. It might be that's Babadook though. I don't know if that's the same
Babadook.
thing. Yeah,
I liked that one.
That was a good movie.
I enjoyed this book. It wasn't very scary to me, except for the people themselves.
Yeah.
They were very scary. Now, I will say that by the time it was wrapping up and they were ready to go after Barlow, that's his name. Go after Barlow and finish this, I couldn't put the book down. Yeah. I needed to see it through and be done with it.
The final battle with Barlow was short. They like show up, he's in his coffin, kabang, get out of there. It was
scary
short.
for a second though, because Mark got kind of hypnotized and was trying to kill Ben, and but I love how, you know, he goes to stab dude, Barlow wakes up, but like Ben follows through on it. You know, there was like a pause, but it wasn't like the movie dramatic monologue speech situation. Like all the speeches had already been made. This was the last chance. Yeah. Dude was waking up. Yeah. And he just did. That's how all defeats against evil should be handled in all books and films.
You know, in some vampire lingo, they call that look, they call it glamour. And maybe that has something to do with, you know, people see what somebody else has, right? They see the wealth, they see the power, and they're attracted to that. And so because they're attracted to that, they become this thing, abandoning their other people, and are, you know, now become, you know.
Well, and like when Barlow has people in his grasp, he is telling them that they're going to get everything they've ever wanted. Yeah. You know, that's what he told Dud, and that's what he told Ava Miller, and who I loved, by the way. I was sad to see her get ate.
What was Barlow's sidekick's name? Slanter, Slacker, Salter. No. Well, something like that. Whatever. He was weird. He's a legit groupie for like an evil demon person. Knew that. And was like hanging out, like maybe someday he'll choose me.
Was he a simi?
And then he got.
Oh my gosh. That reminds me of, what is it, Things They Do in the Dark or whatever. There's a show on Hulu, What We Do in the Dark. It's a vampire show, but it's like a comedy.
Is that the one with the people that all live together?
Yeah.
I've only ever watched the one.
And there's one that's like, maybe this is the day I'm going to become one.
Oh, yeah. That's exactly the vibe I got.
Funny. So, but was this guy mid-phase undead? Like how...
No, he was a human being. He was a daywalker, right? I think is what they call him.
Yeah. Thanks, South Park.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a straight up human being.
Just a person.
Hoping to get his piece or whatever, and then they just like drank his blood and left him for dead, ultimately, is what happened.
Strung him up like a pig.
Yeah.
That was really cool that Mark had read his like Houdini book and was able to like puff himself up and then think himself through it. Man, to be that calm, to be that calculated, you know, in a crisis, good for him. Yeah. I really liked Mark. He was a cool kid.
Yeah, he was a cool kid. Well, I think that's about it for this one.
Yeah. So
thank you very much for reading with us.
You know, that was the whole book. So I know we missed stuff. So I can't wait to see what you guys put in the comments. So please don't hold back and tell us all your thoughts and theories and favorite parts and what you were most afraid of.
And don't get off after this video. Watch the next one so you can find out what our next book is.
Yeah, we'll post our syllabus episode for the next book.
You have to click on that one though.
Okay. Bye.
See y'all next time.